The midsummer sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Cottonwood Springs, a small but growing settlement nestled in the shadow of the Guadalupe Mountains of West Texas. Sheriff Emmett Blackwood wiped the sweat from his brow with a bandana that had long since lost its original color, now stained with the red dust that seemed to cling to everything in this godforsaken corner of the frontier. At 45, the weight of his badge felt heavier with each passing year, his weathered face bearing the marks of a man who'd seen more than his fair share of the brutality the West had to offer. Inside the jailhouse, the air hung thick and stagnant, even with the windows thrown open to catch any hint of a breeze. Deputy Wallace Jenkins slouched in his chair, boots propped up on the desk, while his younger counterpart, Deputy Samuel Parker, paced the floorboards nervously. The reason for their discomfort sat silently in the corner cell, a stone-faced Apache warrior who'd been found wandering on the outskirts of town, covered in blood that wasn't his own. For 3 days now, he had uttered not a single word, his dark eyes revealing nothing as he stared through the iron bars with silent contempt. "Damn it all to hell," Blackwood muttered, slamming his fist against the wall. "Margaret Turner's been missing for 2 days now, and this red devil knows something. I'm sure of it." The disappearance of the schoolteacher had sent shockwaves through the community. Margaret, a gentlewoman in her 30s who had traveled west from Boston 2 years prior, was beloved by all for her kindness and dedication to the town's children. Her empty classroom and the signs of struggle in her small home on the edge of town pointed to a grim reality no one wanted to face. "We've tried everything short of putting a bullet in him," Jenkins drawled, lazily spinning his revolver on the desk. "He ain't gonna talk, Sheriff. Probably doesn't understand a lick of English anyway." The younger deputy, Parker, a man barely into his 20s with an eager disposition that often grated on Blackwood's nerves, suggested, "What about that Indian agent from Fort Davis? Could send a rider, have him here in 2 days, maybe." Blackwood shook his head grimly. 2 days is too long. If Margaret's alive out there." He let the sentence hang unfinished in the heavy air. The creak of the jailhouse door cut through the tension, and all 3 men turned to see a slender figure silhouetted against the harsh sunlight streaming in from outside. Hannah Ward stepped into the shadows of the jailhouse, her threadbare dress hanging loosely on her small frame, auburn hair pulled back in a simple braid that trailed down her back. At 17, her face still carried the softness of youth, but her eyes, a startling clear blue, held a hardness that spoke of trials beyond her years. The men had largely ignored her presence in town since her arrival 6 months ago, working odd jobs at the general store and helping at the town's only hotel. Orphaned during a Comanche raid on a wagon train when she was just 7, Hannah had spent the next decade being passed between missionary families and remote trading posts across the territories. The cruel twists of fate had forged her into something both tough and strangely fluid, a girl who existed between worlds, not fully belonging to the white settlements nor to the native lands, but somehow surviving in the space between. "Girl, this ain't no place for you right now," Blackwood said gruffly, already moving to usher her back out the door. "We've got important business to attend to." Hannah stood her ground, her gaze shifting past the sheriff to the silent figure in the cell. "I heard about Mrs. Turner," she said, her voice soft but steady, "and I heard you caught an Apache who might know something." Jenkins snorted derisively, rising from his chair. "And what business is that of yours, little miss? Best run along back to the hotel before Mrs. Winters notices you're gone." Hannah's eyes never left the prisoner as she spoke. "I can help you talk to him." The declaration hung in the air for a moment before all 3 lawmen erupted in laughter. "You?" Parker chuckled, shaking his head. "And how exactly do you propose to do that? You some kind of Indian whisperer?" Hannah's expression remained unchanged, her stoic demeanor a stark contrast to their mocking amusement. "I speak Comanche and Apache better than you speak English," said the orphaned girl, her voice quiet but firm. "I spent 3 years living with the Quahadi Comanche after they took me. Later, I lived at the trading post at Paint Rock, where I learned Apache from the bands that came to trade." Sheriff Blackwood laughed, the sound echoing off the wooden walls of the jailhouse. "Well, ain't that something, boys? Seems we've got ourselves a regular little ambassador right here in Cottonwood Springs." His deputies joined in the laughter, though Parker's seemed more uncertain than genuine. Hannah stood silently, waiting for their amusement to subside. When it did, she simply repeated, "I can help you find Mrs. Turner." Blackwood's smile faded as he studied the girl more carefully, noting for the first time the small scar that ran from her temple into her hairline, the kind of mark left by a tomahawk that nearly found its mark. He'd seen similar scars on survivors before. "Listen, girl," Blackwood said, his tone softer now but still dismissive. "This ain't some game. That man in there," he jerked his thumb toward the cell, "he's dangerous, and whatever he knows about Mrs. Turner, he ain't exactly eager to share it with us." Hannah's gaze shifted to the Apache prisoner, and she spoke, not to the sheriff, but directly to the man behind bars. The sounds that emerged from her throat were nothing like the English she'd been speaking. Instead, they were fluid, complex syllables that seemed to rise and fall like water over stones. The change in the prisoner was immediate and profound. His head snapped up, dark eyes widening slightly as they fixed on the slight figure of the girl. After a moment's hesitation, he replied, the words flowing rapidly in a language none of the lawmen understood. Sheriff Blackwood went pale, his mockery evaporating in an instant as he witnessed the exchange. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, taking an unconscious step backward. The conversation between Hannah and the prisoner continued for several minutes, the girl's expression remaining neutral while the Apaches shifted between suspicion, surprise, and eventually a reluctant respect. Finally, Hannah turned back to the stunned sheriff. "His name is Tanito. He's a scout for Chief Victorio's band," she explained calmly. "He says he didn't take Mrs. Turner, but he knows who did. A group of white men, not Indians." Blackwood's brow furrowed in confusion. "White men? Are you sure you understood him right?" Hannah nodded. "He says they were wearing pieces of Apache clothing, trying to make it look like an Indian raid. He followed their trail because he was curious why they would do this. That's how he got the blood on him. He had a brief skirmish with one of them who spotted him watching their camp." The sheriff exchanged glances with his deputies, the implications settling heavily on all of them. "Ask him where they've taken her," Blackwood demanded, his earlier skepticism now completely abandoned. Hannah turned back to Tanito and spoke again in Apache, her hands occasionally moving in subtle gestures that seemed to emphasize her words. The prisoner's response was lengthy, punctuated by what appeared to be descriptions of landmarks. When he finished, Hannah faced the lawman once more. "He says they're camped in a canyon about 15 miles southwest of here. It's hidden. You wouldn't find it unless you knew where to look. There are 4 men, heavily armed. They're keeping Mrs. Turner alive, but Tanito doesn't know why they took her." Blackwood paced the small confines of the jailhouse, mind racing. "Could be ransom," Jenkins suggested. "Her brother back east has money, doesn't he?" Parker nodded. "Or could be worse," he added grimly, avoiding looking at Hannah as he spoke. The implication hung heavy in the air. "Ask him if he'll lead us there," Blackwood said suddenly, turning back to Hannah. "Tell him I'll set him free if he helps us bring Mrs. Turner back safely." Hannah relayed the offer, and Tanito's response was immediate, a sharp negative gesture accompanied by rapid speech. "He says he won't help you directly," Hannah translated. "His people are already being hunted by the army. If he's seen working with white men, especially lawmen, he'd be considered a traitor by his own kind." Blackwood cursed under his breath, but Hannah continued, "But he says he will show me where the camp is. And I can guide you there." The sheriff's expression hardened. "Absolutely not. This is no business for a girl. We'll find another way." Hannah's blue eyes flashed with a determination that momentarily startled Blackwood. "There is no other way," she insisted. "Without Tanito's help, you'll never find that canyon in time. And he won't help you without me as intermediary." A heavy silence fell over the jailhouse as Blackwood weighed his options, the ticking of the wall clock suddenly loud in the stillness. "Sheriff?" Parker ventured hesitantly. "She might be right. Mrs. Turner's been gone 2 days already, if what the Apache says is true. And it's white men who took her." He left the rest unsaid, but they all understood the implications. Time was running out for the schoolteacher. Blackwood rubbed his hand across his stubbled jaw, a habit he'd developed over years of difficult decisions. "All right," he said finally, his voice gruff with reluctance. "But you stay back once we locate the camp, you hear me? First sign of trouble, you hide yourself away." Hannah nodded, though something in her eyes suggested she had her own ideas about how things would proceed. "Jenkins, go fetch my spare rifle and some provisions. Parker, saddle up 5 horses. He turned his attention back to Hannah. "Tell him he'll be shackled until we're well away from town. Can't have folks seeing me release an Apache prisoner without explanation." Hannah spoke to Tanito again, and after a brief exchange, he nodded his agreement, his dark eyes now fixed on Blackwood with an unsettling intensity, as the lawmen busied themselves with preparations. Hannah remained near the cell, occasionally exchanging quiet words with Tanito. Blackwood noticed how the Apache's demeanor had changed. No longer the stoic, silent figure of earlier, but engaged and alert, his responses to the girl coming without hesitation. There was a familiarity in the way they communicated that went beyond mere language translation, and it made the sheriff deeply uneasy. It was as if the girl had removed a mask she'd been wearing for months, revealing something underneath that belonged more to the wild territories than to civilization. The thought sent a chill down his spine, despite the oppressive heat of the jailhouse. What other secrets might this orphaned girl be hiding behind those clear blue eyes? And more importantly, could he truly trust her with their lives as they ventured into hostile territory in search of Margaret Turner? The questions lingered uneasily in his mind as he checked his Colt revolver and prepared for what promised to be a dangerous journey into the unforgiving heart of the frontier. Within the hour, an unusual party departed Cottonwood Springs, heading southwest under the harsh Texas sun. Sheriff Blackwood led the way, his Winchester rifle resting across his saddle, followed closely by his deputies. Tanito rode forth in line, his hands free of shackles now that they'd left town behind. His posture straight and proud atop the sorrel mare they'd provided. Hannah brought up the rear, occasionally exchanging words with the Apache in his native tongue, words that made Blackwood increasingly uncomfortable as they traveled farther from the safety of settlement. The landscape grew more rugged as they rode, the gentle rolling hills giving way to jagged outcroppings and deep arroyos carved by flash floods. Vegetation became sparse, limited to hardy mesquite, cactus, and the occasional stubborn oak that had somehow found enough water to survive in this harsh environment. The sun beat down relentlessly, and by midday, the heat had become almost unbearable, forcing them to seek shelter in the shadow of a limestone bluff. "Ask him how much farther," Blackwood instructed Hannah as they dismounted to rest the horses. The girl conversed briefly with Tanito, then replied, "He says we're still several hours away. We'll need to enter the foothills before sundown and make the final approach by early morning." Jenkins spat into the dust. "How do we know this ain't some trap? Could be leading us straight into an ambush." His hand rested nervously on the butt of his revolver as he eyed Tanito with open suspicion. The Apache returned his gaze impassively, saying nothing. Hannah shook her head. "He has no reason to trick us. His people are camped far from here, moving north toward the Staked Plains. He was traveling alone when he discovered the men who took Mrs. Turner." Blackwood studied the girl closely, still unnerved by the ease with which she slipped between worlds. "And why should he care what happens to a white woman?" he asked bluntly. Hannah's response was equally direct. "He doesn't, but he despises those who would commit evil acts and blame his people for them. It brings more soldiers, more death to the Apache." As they prepared to resume their journey, Parker approached Hannah somewhat hesitantly. The young deputy had been watching her with a mixture of curiosity and unease throughout the morning. "Miss Ward," he began awkwardly, "I was wondering, how did you come to speak their languages so well? Most folks who've been captured, well, they don't usually talk about it afterward." Hannah secured her canteen to her saddle before answering, her movements deliberate and practiced. "The Comanche who took me was called Running Elk. He had lost his daughter to smallpox the winter before. When they raided our wagon train, he saw me hiding under a blanket in the back of our wagon. Instead of killing me, he took me to replace the child he had lost." Her voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of the emotion one might expect when recounting such a traumatic event. "I lived with his family for 3 years. His wife, Singing Bird, taught me their ways, their language. I was young enough to learn quickly." Parker's expression reflected his discomfort with her candid recounting. "But how did you get away? How did you end up back among, well, your own kind?" Hannah's blue eyes met his, a hint of something unreadable flickering in their depths. "The army attacked our camp near the Canadian River. Many were killed, including Running Elk. Singing Bird told me to run toward the soldiers, to return to my people. She said it was my only chance to survive." She paused, her gaze drifting to the distant horizon. "So I did. I ran to a young lieutenant who took me to Fort Sill. From there, I was sent to a missionary family in the Indian Territories." She mounted her horse with the fluid grace of someone who had spent more time on horseback than on foot. "The Apache language I learned later at the trading post. The owner's wife was kind to me, let me listen when the Apache came to trade. They thought it amusing that a white girl would want to learn their tongue. Eventually they taught me. The party rode in silence for some time after that, each man digesting Hannah's story and recalibrating their perception of the quiet girl who had lived among them for months without revealing her unusual past. As the afternoon wore on, the terrain became increasingly difficult to navigate. Tanito now rode at the front, guiding them through narrow passes and around treacherous ravines, with the confidence of one who could read the land like a book. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon when he finally raised his hand, signaling for the group to halt. He spoke quietly to Hannah, who translated for the others. "We're close now. The canyon where they're camped lies just beyond that ridge. He suggests we make camp here and approach on foot at first light, when they'll likely be asleep." Blackwood nodded his agreement, dismounting and surveying the small hollow Tanito had chosen. A defensible position, with a clear view of the surrounding terrain, yet hidden from casual observation. As darkness fell, the group settled around a small, carefully banked fire that provided warmth without producing enough light to be spotted from a distance. The mood was tense, each man lost in his own thoughts about the confrontation that awaited them at dawn. Hannah sat slightly apart from the others, conversing in low tones with Tanito. Occasionally, a word or phrase would drift to Blackwood's ears, unfamiliar sounds that only heightened his sense that the girl was somehow foreign despite her pale skin and blue eyes. Eventually, Jenkins voiced what all 3 lawmen had been thinking. "Sheriff, can we really trust them? Either of them?" He kept his voice low, eyes darting toward Hannah and the Apache. "What if this is all some elaborate revenge? The girl spent years with the Comanche, for God's sake. Who knows where her loyalties really lie?" Blackwood sighed heavily, poking at the embers with a stick. "We don't have much choice, Jenkins. If Margaret's out there, we have to try. Besides," he glanced at Hannah's slight figure, "she's just a girl. What harm could she do?" The night passed uneasily, with each man taking turns standing watch while the others tried to rest. When the eastern sky began to lighten, Blackwood roused the group. "Time to move," he whispered, checking his revolver before securing it in his holster. "Jenkins, you and Parker circle around to the west side of the canyon. Hannah, you stay here with the horses. Tanito and I will approach from the east." Hannah immediately shook her head. "No, I need to come with you. Tanito won't go without me, and you need him to find the exact location of their camp." The sheriff's jaw tightened in frustration, but before he could argue, Tanito spoke, his words unintelligible to all but Hannah. The girl listened, then turned to Blackwood. He says there's another way. He can guide all of us to a high point overlooking the camp. From there, you can see everything without being spotted. Then you can make your plan. Blackwood hesitated, then nodded curtly. Fine, lead the way. But when the shooting starts, if it comes to that, you find cover and stay there. Understand? They moved silently through the pre-dawn darkness, leaving their horses secured in the hollow. Tanito led them along a narrow game trail that wound its way up the side of a steep incline, eventually bringing them to a rocky outcropping that offered a perfect vantage point over the canyon below. As the first rays of sunlight spilled over the eastern horizon, they could make out a small camp nestled among the trees near a tiny spring. 4 men were visible, one still sleeping while the others moved about, preparing a morning fire. A crude lean-to had been constructed against the canyon wall, and within it they could see a figure that had to be Margaret Turner. She appeared to be bound but alive, sitting upright against the rock face. There she is, Parker whispered, relief evident in his voice. Thank God she's alive. Blackwood studied the layout of the camp carefully, noting the positions of the men and their weapons. All right, he said finally, here's how we'll play this. Jenkins, you and Parker work your way down to those boulders on the south side. I'll approach from the north. When I give the signal, 1 shot in the air, we call out for them to surrender. And if they don't, Jenkins asked, though they all knew the answer. Then we do what needs doing, Blackwood replied grimly. He turned to Hannah and Tanito. You two stay here, keep watch, but stay out of sight. Hannah translated for Tanito, who nodded his understanding, though his dark eyes betrayed a certain skepticism about the lawman's plan. As the deputies prepared to make their way down to the positions Blackwood had indicated, Hannah suddenly gripped the sheriff's arm. Wait, she said urgently. Look closely at the man by the fire, the one with the red bandana. Blackwood squinted, trying to make out details in the strengthening dawn light. What about him? Hannah's voice was tight with recognition. I know him. His name is Clayton Reed. He worked at the general store in Cottonwood Springs for about a month, left just before I arrived. Mr. Guthrie mentioned him once, said he was asking too many questions about the wealthier residents in town. Blackwood's expression darkened. You sure about this? Hannah nodded firmly. Positive. I've seen his picture in Mr. Guthrie's office. And the one sleeping with the beard, that's Rufus Dalton. He was in town just last month, claimed to be a cattle buyer. The sheriff exchanged glances with his deputies, the implications settling heavily upon them. So they're not just random outlaws, he muttered. They've been planning this, watching the town, learning who might be valuable. He looked back at Margaret's captive form. Jenkins, change of plans. They know the town too well for this to be random. I'm betting they've got friends back in Cottonwood Springs, maybe even someone expecting word from them. We need at least one of them alive to question. Jenkins nodded his understanding. Focus on wounding, not killing, Blackwood continued, at least until we know what we're dealing with. As the lawmen prepared to descend toward the camp, Hannah spoke quietly with Tanito. After a brief exchange, she turned back to Blackwood. Tanito says your plan will get you all killed, she stated bluntly. These men are not fools. They've posted a lookout on the ridge to the west. You can't see him from here, but he's there, and they'll have escape routes planned. The sheriff frowned, scanning the western ridge, but seeing nothing. How does he know this? Hannah's reply was immediate, because it's what he would do. And he watched them for nearly a day before you captured him. There was a 5th man then, the one he fought with. These men are organized, careful. Blackwood hesitated, torn between proceeding with his original plan and heeding this unexpected warning. Tanito offers another way, Hannah continued. He can neutralize the lookout silently, while I create a distraction at the camp. When the men are confused, you and your deputies can take positions and demand their surrender. Jenkins scoffed quietly. A distraction? What kind of distraction could you possibly create that wouldn't get you shot on sight? Hannah's expression remained calm. her blue eyes steady as she replied, "I'll walk into their camp and speak to them in Apache. They'll think I'm a captive who's escaped from an Indian raid nearby. While they're trying to figure out what to do with me, Tanito will have taken care of the lookout and you can get into position." Blackwood shook his head emphatically. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. I won't risk a young girl's life on such a foolhardy plan." Hannah's voice took on an edge he hadn't heard before. "I've survived worse than these men, Sheriff. And Margaret Turner doesn't have time for us to debate. Every minute increases the risk that they'll decide she's more trouble than she's worth." Her gaze swept over all three lawmen. "Besides, do you have a better plan that accounts for the lookout you can't even see?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Finally, Blackwood sighed heavily, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical burden. "All right," he conceded reluctantly, "but at the first sign that things are going wrong, we move in, ready or not. Understand?" Hannah nodded, then turned to relay the plan to Tanito in rapid Apache. The scout listened intently, then responded with what appeared to be several questions. Their exchange continued for a moment before Tanito nodded his agreement. Without another word, he slipped away from the outcropping, moving with the silent grace of a shadow along the ridgeline, heading west toward the unseen lookout. Hannah watched him go, then began making her own preparations. She untied her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders, and used a bit of dirt to smudge her face and clothes. "Give me 20 minutes, she instructed Blackwood. "By then, Tanito will have dealt with the lookout, and I'll have their attention in the camp. When you see me talking with all of them, that's your signal to move into position." Before any of the men could raise further objections, Hannah began making her way down the slope, choosing a path that would bring her into the canyon from the east, as if she had come from the direction of Cottonwood Springs rather than their current position. Blackwood watched her go with a growing sense of unease. "Sheriff," Parker whispered urgently, "we can't let her do this. It's madness." The older man's weathered face was grim as he replied, "Sometimes madness is all we've got. Son, now get ready. When that girl makes her move, we'd better be damn sure we're ready to make ours." The deputies reluctantly took up positions that would allow them to descend quickly into the canyon when the time came, while Blackwood remained at the vantage point, rifle ready, eyes fixed on the camp below, where 4 men remained completely unaware of the approaching storm. The sun had fully cleared the horizon, bathing the canyon in golden morning light, when Hannah made her appearance. She stumbled into the clearing, her hair disheveled, clothes dirty, breathing heavily as if she had been running for hours. The effect was immediate. All 4 men leapt to their feet, weapons drawn and pointed at the unexpected intruder. Clayton Reed, the man with the red bandana, was the first to speak. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his revolver aimed squarely at Hannah's chest. Instead of answering in English, Hannah launched into a frantic stream of Apache, gesturing wildly toward the east. Her performance so convincing that even Blackwood, watching from above, felt a momentary flash of doubt about her true allegiance. The kidnappers exchanged confused glances, weapons still raised, but uncertainty now evident in their postures. "What's she saying?" one of them asked. "Hell if I know," Reed responded, taking a cautious step toward Hannah. "Hey girl, you speak English?" Hannah paused her Apache tirade, allowing her expression to show recognition of the language. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling perfectly. "English, yes. Help, please." She pointed frantically eastward again. "Apache come, many Apache. Attack wagon, kill all, I run." The men's confusion gave way to alarm as they scanned the horizon in the direction she indicated. "Apache, how many?" Reed demanded. Hannah held up both hands, fingers spread. 2 hands, maybe more. "They chased me long time. I hide, then run again." As she spoke, she took several steps deeper into the camp, her movements appearing random, but actually bringing her closer to the lean-to, where Margaret Turner watched the unfolding scene with wide, fearful eyes. "We need to move," one of the men urged Reed. "If there are Apache in the area, this whole plan is shot to hell." Reed silenced him with a gesture. his eyes narrowing as he studied Hannah more closely. "Something ain't right," he muttered. "Apache don't usually leave survivors, especially not young girls." Hannah's expression betrayed nothing as she continued her performance, now adding what appeared to be a plea for water, gesturing toward her throat and the canteens visible near the campfire. Reed hesitated, then nodded to one of his men. "Give her some water, Jackson, but keep your gun on her." As the man called Jackson moved to fetch a canteen, Reed turned to the bearded man, Rufus Dalton. "Take Simmons and check the perimeter. If there are Apache out there, I want to know about it." The two men nodded and moved off, rifles ready, leaving Reed and Jackson alone with Hannah and their captive. From his vantage point, Blackwood could see that all 4 kidnappers were now visible and separated, 2 heading toward the edges of the camp, 2 remaining in the center. More importantly, there was no sign of the supposed lookout on the western ridge, suggesting Tanito had successfully neutralized that threat. It was the opportunity they had been waiting for. With a deep breath, Blackwood raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the air. The sharp crack echoed through the canyon, freezing everyone below in momentary shock. "U.S. Marshal!" Blackwood shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Drop your weapons and put your hands in the air. You're surrounded." The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Reed dove for cover behind a fallen log, dragging Hannah roughly with him as a human shield. Jackson hesitated just long enough for Parker, who had worked his way into position at the south end of the camp, to put a bullet in his leg. The man went down with a howl of pain, his revolver falling from his grasp. The 2 men who had been checking the perimeter spun around, weapons raised, searching frantically for targets. Jenkins, positioned among a cluster of boulders to the west, fired twice in rapid succession. One bullet struck Dalton in the shoulder, spinning him around but not taking him down. The other missed Simmons entirely, kicking up dust at his feet. "You're outgunned, Reed!" Blackwood called out, deliberately using the man's name. "We know who you are, and we know about your operation in Cottonwood Springs. Give it up now, and maybe you won't hang." Reed's response was a barrage of gunfire in Blackwood's direction, forcing the sheriff to duck behind the rocks. "You know nothing, lawman," Reed shouted back, "and if you want this girl to live, you'll back off now." He tightened his grip on Hannah, pressing the barrel of his revolver against her temple. "I'll put a bullet in her head, I swear to God." For the first time since she had entered the camp, Hannah's composure faltered, genuine fear flashing across her face as she found herself caught in a standoff she hadn't anticipated. Blackwood cursed under his breath, the situation having deteriorated far faster than he'd expected. Reed now had a hostage, and the other 3 men, though wounded or pinned down, were still armed and dangerous. "Let the girl go, Reed!" Blackwood tried again, keeping his rifle trained on the fallen log that concealed the outlaw and his captive. "She's got nothing to do with this. It's Margaret Turner you took, and it's her we've come for." Reed's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Oh, she's got plenty to do with this now, Marshal. She's my ticket out of here." He raised his voice further. "Here's what's going to happen. You and your deputies are going to throw down your weapons and show yourselves. Then I'm going to take the girl and Mrs. Turner, and we're going to ride out of here. Anyone tries to follow, they both die." The standoff had reached a critical impasse, with neither side willing to yield and the lives of 2 innocent women hanging in the balance. Blackwood exchanged desperate glances with his deputies, seeking some solution that wouldn't end in bloodshed. Then, just as the tension seemed ready to snap, a new voice entered the fray, not in English, but in the flowing syllables of Apache. Tanito stepped into the clearing from the northern edge, bow drawn, arrow pointed directly at Reed's position behind the log. His words were unintelligible to the lawman, but their threatening tone was unmistakable. Reed's head snapped up at the sound, his eyes widening in shock at the sight of the Apache warrior standing barely 20 yards away, weapon ready. "What the hell is this?" he hissed, his grip on Hannah momentarily slackening in his surprise. It was all the opening she needed. With a swift, practiced movement that spoke of lessons learned in a harder school than any white settlement could provide, Hannah drove her elbow sharply into Reed's ribs while simultaneously twisting away from the revolver at her temple. The outlaw grunted in pain, his finger reflexively tightening on the trigger. The shot went wild, the bullet embedding itself harmlessly in the dirt as Hannah continued her escape, rolling clear of his grasp and scrambling toward the cover of a nearby boulder. The moment of confusion was all Blackwood and his deputies needed. 3 rifles fired almost simultaneously, the sound like thunder in the confined space of the canyon. Reed screamed as a bullet tore through his shooting arm, his revolver falling useless to the ground. Dalton, already wounded in the shoulder, took another hit to the leg and collapsed, while Simmons threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. Only Jackson, the first man wounded, attempted further resistance, reaching for the fallen revolver near his position. His movement caught Tonito's attention, and with fluid grace, the Apache released his arrow. It found its mark with unerring accuracy, pinning Jackson's hand to the ground inches from the gun, his howl of agony echoing off the canyon walls. The firefight was over as quickly as it had begun, leaving all 4 kidnappers wounded and disarmed, the lawmen and their unlikely allies victorious. Blackwood wasted no time in securing the prisoners, binding their wounds just enough to keep them from bleeding out before they could face justice back in Cottonwood Springs. Parker hurried to free Margaret Turner from her bonds, the schoolteacher's tearful gratitude evident as she embraced her young rescuer. Hannah, somewhat shaken but otherwise unharmed, stood apart from the others, engaged in quiet conversation with Tonito. The Apache scout's posture remained alert, his dark eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if expecting further threats to materialize at any moment. When Blackwood approached them, having ensured the prisoners were securely bound, Hannah turned to him with a small, tired smile. "It seems your plan worked after all, Sheriff," she said softly. "Though perhaps not exactly as you imagined it would." Blackwood shook his head, a mixture of admiration and lingering unease in his expression. "I'd say it was more your plan than mine, Miss Ward, and without you and your friend here, I doubt Mrs. Turner would be alive right now." Hannah translated his words for Tonito, whose response was brief but accompanied by a slight inclination of his head that might have been respect. "He says he will leave us now," Hannah explained. "His part in this is done, and he must return to his people before the soldiers find him." Blackwood hesitated, his sense of duty warring with the debt he now owed this man who, by all official standards, was an enemy of the United States. Finally, he nodded. "Tell him he's free to go, with my thanks. I gave my word, and I'll keep it. As far as Cottonwood Springs is concerned, our Apache prisoner escaped during the rescue operation, which isn't far from the truth." Hannah relayed the message, and Tonito's expression softened slightly. He spoke again, more words than he had offered previously, his gaze moving between Hannah and the sheriff as he did so. When he finished, Hannah's translation came with a faint smile. "He says you are an unusual white man, Sheriff Blackwood, one who keeps his promises. He will remember this." With a final nod to Hannah and a wary glance at the bound prisoners, Tonito melted back into the landscape, disappearing among the rocks and scrub brush as silently as he had appeared. Blackwood watched him go, aware that he had just violated several laws and regulations regarding hostile Indians, yet unable to feel anything but rightness in his decision. He turned his attention back to Hannah, who stood watching the horizon where Tonito had vanished, an unreadable expression on her young face. "Miss Ward," he began awkwardly, "I owe you an apology. I underestimated you, and I was wrong to do so." Hannah's clear blue eyes met his, holding a wisdom far beyond her 17 years. "Most people do, Sheriff," she replied simply. "It's easier to see what you expect to see. A quiet orphan girl who works at the hotel and minds her own business, not someone who's lived in 2 worlds and learned to survive in both." As they prepared to return to Cottonwood Springs with their prisoners and the rescued schoolteacher, Blackwood found himself watching Hannah with new eyes. The way she moved, the confidence with which she handled her horse, the occasional phrases of Apache or Comanche that slipped from her lips when she thought no one was listening, all spoke of a life far different from what he had assumed, in this harsh frontier where the boundaries between civilization and wilderness, between white settlements and native territories, were constantly shifting and often bloody. Hannah Ward stood as a rare bridge between worlds. And though such a position might forever mark her as an outsider to both, Blackwood couldn't help but wonder if it was precisely such boundaries that needed crossing, if the West was ever to find peace. As they rode eastward, the rising sun at their backs casting long shadows before them, the sheriff made a silent vow to remember the lesson he had learned this day, that wisdom and strength could come from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes the most valuable allies were those who walked between worlds. The journey back to Cottonwood Springs took the better part of the day, with frequent stops to tend to the prisoners' wounds and allow Margaret Turner to rest. The schoolteacher, though physically unharmed, was exhausted from her ordeal, her usual composure shaken by the days spent in captivity. She rode double with Deputy Parker, occasionally dozing against his shoulder as the gentle rocking of the horse lulled her into brief snatches of sleep. The four prisoners, secured to their mounts with rope and closely guarded by Blackwood and Jenkins, maintained a sullen silence for most of the journey, though Reed occasionally broke the quiet with muttered threats or curses that the lawmen ignored. Hannah rode at the rear of the procession, her thoughts clearly elsewhere as she occasionally glanced back toward the distant mountains where Tanito had disappeared. As they approached the outskirts of town, Blackwood dropped back to ride alongside her, keeping his voice low to avoid being overheard by the others. "Miss Ward," he began, "before we reach town, there's something we need to discuss." Hannah's expression remained neutral as she waited for him to continue. "The story we're going to tell about how we found Mrs. Turner and captured these men needs to be simplified." The sheriff chose his words carefully. The townspeople wouldn't understand about Tanito helping us or about your history with the Comanche. There'd be questions, rumors. It could make life difficult for you in Cottonwood Springs. Hannah's mouth curved in a small, knowing smile that held no real humor. "You mean they might not want an Indian lover living among them, working in their businesses, talking to their children?" The blunt assessment made Blackwood wince, but he didn't deny it. "Something like that, yes. People fear what they don't understand, and most folks around here have only seen the bloody side of relations with the native tribes. They wouldn't comprehend what you've experienced, or why you helped Tanito escape." Hannah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the small cluster of buildings that made up Cottonwood Springs was just becoming visible in the distance. "What story do you propose we tell then?" she finally asked. Blackwood sighed, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow before replacing it. "We say that you helped translate for the Apache prisoner, allowing us to learn where Mrs. Turner was being held. We rode out, found the kidnappers' camp, and rescued her after a brief gunfight. During the confusion, the Apache escaped. Simple, straightforward, and close enough to the truth without raising uncomfortable questions." Hannah considered this, then nodded slowly. "And my knowledge of native languages. How do we explain that?" The sheriff grimaced slightly. "We say you learned a little from missionaries who worked with the tribes. Enough to get basic information, nothing more. No need to mention your years with the Comanche or your familiarity with their ways." "A comfortable lie that lets everyone sleep better at night," Hannah murmured, a hint of bitterness in her tone. "Except perhaps me." Blackwood had no good response to that, and they rode in silence for several minutes before he spoke again. "I know it's not fair, asking you to hide part of who you are, but I also know how people can be, especially in small towns like this. They'd never look at you the same way again if they knew the full truth." Hannah's blue eyes, when they met his, held a clarity that was almost startling in its intensity. "They don't look at me at all, Sheriff. Not really. They see what they want to see, a quiet orphan girl who causes no trouble. It's been that way in every settlement I've lived in since leaving the Comanche. I doubt Cottonwood Springs will be any different." The resignation in her voice troubled Blackwood more than he wanted to admit, but he couldn't deny the truth of her assessment. As they rode into town, word of their approach spread quickly. By the time they reached the main street, a crowd had gathered, eager to witness the return of their beloved schoolteacher and see the men who had dared to abduct her. Margaret Turner was helped down from Parker's horse, amid cheers and tearful greetings from her friends and students. The prisoners were marched grimly toward the jailhouse, met with jeers and hostile stares from the townspeople. Amid the commotion, Hannah slipped away quietly, leading her horse toward the stables behind the hotel where she worked and lived, seemingly content to fade once more into the background of town life. Blackwood noticed her departure, but made no move to stop her. There would be time later for a more thorough discussion of what had transpired in the canyon, and perhaps for a deeper conversation about her unusual past and uncertain future. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity as statements were taken, charges filed, and arrangements made to transport the prisoners to the territorial court for trial. The story Blackwood had crafted spread through town, growing more elaborate with each retelling, as is often the case with such tales. Margaret Turner was celebrated as a survivor, the lawmen as heroes. And even Hannah received a small measure of recognition for her role in translating the Apache prisoners' information, though this aspect was largely overshadowed by the more dramatic elements of the rescue. Throughout it all, Hannah maintained her usual quiet demeanor, continuing her work at the hotel and offering only brief, modest responses when questioned about her part in the events. To most observers, she appeared unchanged by the experience, perhaps a bit more reserved than usual, but otherwise the same unassuming orphan girl who had lived among them for months without drawing particular notice. 1 week after the rescue, with the prisoners safely on their way to face justice and life in Cottonwood Springs, settling back into its normal rhythms, Sheriff Blackwood found himself walking toward the hotel in the quiet hours of early evening. He had seen little of Hannah since their return, and something about their last conversation on the trail had lingered in his mind, prompting this unplanned visit. He found her in the small garden behind the hotel, hanging laundry on a line as the setting sun cast long shadows across the yard. She looked up at his approach, her expression revealing neither surprise nor particular pleasure at his arrival. "Sheriff Blackwood," she acknowledged with a small nod. "What brings you here this evening? Has there been some development with the prisoners?" Blackwood shook his head, suddenly feeling awkward and unsure of his purpose. "No, nothing like that. They're halfway to Fort Davis by now, with Jenkins and Parker escorting them. I just wanted to check on you. See how you're doing after everything that happened." Hannah finished hanging a sheet before responding, her movements efficient and practiced. "I'm fine, Sheriff. It takes more than a few rough men with guns to unsettle me." There was a hint of dry humor in her tone, a reminder of all she had endured long before coming to Cottonwood Springs. Blackwood nodded, leaning against the fence post as he watched her work. "I've been thinking about what you said on the ride back, about people not really seeing you, about having to hide parts of who you are to fit into places like this." Hannah paused, turning to face him fully, her expression guarded yet curious. "And what conclusions have you reached from these thoughts, Sheriff?" Her directness was refreshing, if somewhat discomforting. Blackwood removed his hat, turning it in his hands as he chose his words carefully. "I think it's a damn shame, is what I think. You saved Margaret Turner's life, probably all our lives, because of the very things you have to hide. Your knowledge of Apache, your connection to Tanito, your understanding of both worlds, none of that should be something you're ashamed of or have to conceal." Hannah's eyebrows rose slightly at his vehemence. "That's a surprisingly progressive view for a lawman in these parts, Sheriff Blackwood." he shrugged, a rueful smile touching his weathered face. Maybe I'm getting soft in my old age, or maybe seeing you stand there in that canyon, speaking Apache like you were born to it, made me realize there's more than one way to bridge the gap between settlers and natives. He hesitated, then pressed on. The army's been looking for interpreters, people who can help negotiate with the tribes, prevent misunderstandings that lead to bloodshed. I know the Indian agent at Fort Davis. If you were interested, I could write to him. Tell him about your skills. Might be a better use of your talents than making beds and washing sheets at Mrs. Winter's hotel. The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and potentially life-changing. Hannah's clear blue eyes studied him intently, as if searching for some hidden motive behind his suggestion. "Why would you do that for me?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but steady. Blackwood placed his hat back on his head, adjusting it against the last rays of the setting sun. "Because I owe you for Margaret's life. Because I've seen too much killing between whites and Indians, and maybe someone like you could help stop some of it. Because—" he paused, finding the right words. "Because you deserve the chance to be fully who you are, not just the parts that make folks comfortable." Hannah turned away, resuming her task of hanging laundry, though her movements now seemed more deliberate, as if buying time to consider his offer. "And what about Tanito?" she asked, her back still turned to him. "Would you still have let him go if he hadn't helped us? Or would duty have required you to keep him locked up? Maybe hand him over to the army?" The question was pointed, a test of sorts, and Blackwood recognized it as such. "I'd like to think I would have kept my word regardless," he answered honestly. "But I can't say for certain. What I do know is that meeting him, seeing him as a man with honor rather than just an Apache, has changed something in me. Made me question things I've taken for granted most of my life." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. "That's what someone like you could do, Hannah. Help others see beyond labels and fears. Make them understand that there are good and bad people on both sides of this conflict, just as there are in any war." Hannah finally turned back to face him, the gathering dusk casting shadows across her features that seemed to emphasize both her youth and the wisdom beyond her years that lived in her eyes. "I'll consider your offer, Sheriff," she said quietly. "It's more than anyone has offered me in a long time. Thank you for that, at least." Blackwood nodded, sensing that was all the commitment she was prepared to make at present. "That's all I ask. The offer stands whenever you decide." He tipped his hat in farewell and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him before he had taken more than a few steps. "Sheriff." He looked back, finding her silhouetted against the last golden light of day, a slender figure that somehow seemed to embody the complexities and contradictions of the frontier itself. "The next time you encounter someone who bridges worlds like I do," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the evening stillness, "try not to laugh when they tell you what they can do. It might save you considerable time, and perhaps a bit of embarrassment as well." The gentle rebuke was delivered with the ghost of a smile, taking any sting from the words. Blackwood chuckled, acknowledging the hit with a rueful nod. "I'll keep that in mind. Miss Ward, good evening to you." As he walked back toward the jailhouse, the sheriff found himself reflecting that in this vast, unforgiving land where civilization and wilderness collided, sometimes the most valuable lessons came from those who lived in the spaces between, those rare individuals who could speak to both sides in their native tongues, translating not just words, but worlds. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.